On April 9th, 1965, a first-of-its-kind baseball stadium opened its doors to the public for the very first time. At the time, the stadium was known as a marvel of modern American engineering, the world's very first fully enclosed and air-conditioned stadium designed for outdoor sports and events. And true to its Texas roots, the stadium and everything inside of it was bigger and grander than anything anyone had ever seen before, earning the stadium the nickname the Eighth Wonder of the World. And it earned that nickname over the next 50 years, playing host to some of the most iconic events in sports history and becoming an enduring landmark of the city. But if it weren't for one man's tireless efforts to advance the project, it may not have ever gotten built at all. This is the story of the Houston Astrodome. This is Sports Oddity. Toward the end of the 1950s, the city of Houston was attempting to position itself as a city of the future, and to that end, they had a lot of things going for them. Not only did they have one of the biggest and fastest growing cities in the United States at the time, but as the home of NASA headquarters, they were also squarely at the forefront of the ongoing space race. But even with these advantages, Houston's leadership still knew that more was needed if they wanted to fully achieve their goals for the city. Specifically, they knew that Houston still lacked any major landmarks and attractions, the kind of thing that would make people want to come down for a visit or elevate their status at a national level. And so they started various initiatives in order to bring these kinds of attractions to Houston. Among these initiatives, one of the ways that Houston attempted to go from a minor league city to a major league one was by swapping out their minor league baseball team for a fully fledged MLB franchise. And so, the Houston Sports Association was founded with the express purpose of bringing Major League Baseball to Houston. And leading the charge on this effort was a man that was more than up for the task, Judge Roy Hofheinz. At the time, Hofheinz had developed quite the reputation for himself, not just for his impressive resume, but also for his relentless personality. After graduating from law school at just 19 years old, Hofheinz immediately became a force in Texas state politics, getting elected to the Texas State House at 23, moving on to become a Harris County judge 2 years later, and then becoming the campaign manager for Lyndon Johnson during his House and Senate campaigns. Eventually, he ended up back in Houston, where he would win the mayorship in 1952. But after bumping heads with the city council on more than one occasion, he ended up losing re-election to the very man he replaced in 1955. But at that point, that failure was long in his rearview mirror, because now the only thing he was focused on was bringing an MLB team to Houston. And to that end, there were three main problems that he and his group had to solve. The first issue revolved around where the team was going to play. At the time, the only real stadium in town was the old minor league stadium that the Houston Buffaloes were currently using. But of course, it didn't have the quality or the capacity expected of a major league franchise. And so it was very likely that they were going to have to build a new stadium from scratch. The second issue mainly revolved around climate. Houston was a city that was well known for being extremely hot in the summers, unbearably humid, and very prone to rain. Not exactly ideal for a sport that's typically played outdoors. And in fact, it was these kinds of weather concerns that stopped MLB from expanding into the South in the past. So the group would have to find some way of mitigating these factors in order to get their team to Houston. But the third issue they faced was probably the biggest hurdle of them all. And that was that even though there was plenty of interest from cities all across the country and in Canada, MLB had no interest in expanding the number of teams. And to that point, all efforts to expand the leagues fell on deaf ears. So they'd have to find some way of getting MLB to change their tune. In regard to the first two problems, Hoffheinz and his group had a simple yet radical solution in mind. According to the story, the concept had originated as far back as 1952, when Hoffheinz attempted to take his daughter to a baseball game in Houston. When that game eventually got rained out, allegedly his daughter turned to him and asked him a very simple question: why don't they just play baseball indoors? And the rest, as they say, was history. The HSA announced that if Houston was awarded an MLB team, they would be building a first-of-its-kind indoor, air-conditioned dome stadium for them to play in, thus solving the stadium problem and the weather problem in one fell swoop. But of course, the new stadium proposal meant nothing if they weren't able to get their team in the first place. And so, in order to achieve that goal, the HSA resorted to some out-of-the-box thinking. In 1959, they joined forces with 7 other prospective team owners, who were all similarly pissed off about MLB stonewalling them, and they announced the creation of their own league, which would be known as the Continental League, that would directly compete with the American League and National League. Whether or not this new league was just a giant bluff, we may never know. But we do know that MLB couldn't afford to call it. So, shortly after the announcement of the new league, MLB announced that both the AL and the NL would be adding 2 teams apiece to their ranks. And largely due to the boldness of their proposal for the new stadium, Houston was awarded one of the first 2 franchises. And so, in 1962, the Houston Colt 45s were born. Now that the team was finally in place, all attention turned to building the domed stadium of the future, which was no small task. After all, for reasons both financial and engineering related, many people thought it just couldn't be done. But if there was one person who could make it happen, it was Hoffheinz. And it was in this effort that his political experience really came into play. As you might imagine, this was the biggest stadium project in American history, and by far the most expensive, and it was going to require over $30 million worth of public bonds to make it happen, something that was completely unheard of at the time. Thus, team ownership was placed in the difficult position of having to convince the public to give them the money for the stadium. But largely as a result of a massive PR and lobbying campaign throughout Houston by Hoffheinz and the rest of the ownership group, they were able to get the amount of votes needed to pass the public bond issue, granting them all the funding that they needed to make the stadium a reality. And at that point, it was up to the talented team of architects and engineers to do what was never done before, and make the stadium come to fruition and hopefully give some positive return on the public's investment. And thankfully, they did just that. In fact, not only did they successfully complete the dome, but they actually completed it ahead of schedule, with construction finishing up in November of 1964. And so, after 2 years of playing in a temporary stadium in the literal shadow of the dome as it was being constructed, Houston's team would finally have a new home to call their own for the considerable future. And along with it, they would receive a brand new name that was more fitting of their space-age city and their brand new space-age ballpark, henceforth being known as the Astros. On April 9, 1965, the newly named Astros hosted the Yankees for an exhibition game just before the start of the regular season, the very first game ever hosted at the new Astrodome. And for the capacity crowd that was there to witness that day, they may as well have been witnessing the 8th wonder of the world. It was one thing to read about the Astrodome and hear about it on TV news broadcasts, but it was another to feel the padded seats, to see the first-of-its-kind animated electronic scoreboard, to sit in one of the first-of-its-kind luxury skyboxes. In other words, it more than lived up to the hype. In fact, that exhibition game was such a big deal that the President of the United States himself came to witness it, Hoffheinz's close personal friend Lyndon Johnson. As far as the game itself was concerned, it was nothing all that special. Mickey Mantle got the first hit and first home run in the new park, but it was the Astros that would come away with the first victory in the new stadium. But for everybody that was in attendance that day, they knew that they were witnessing the start of something special, something historic. The Astrodome, which was once thought of as an impossible dream, was now here, and it was bigger and better than anyone could have imagined. But as they would come to find out, that would be just the first of hundreds of memorable nights and historic moments that the ballpark would witness over the next 40 years. In part 2 of this video, we'll be discussing the rise, the decline, and the legacy of the Astrodome. So if you haven't already, please subscribe and hit that notification bell so that you'll be notified when we post that video. Thanks again for watching, and we'll see you next time.